Blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your stomach drops. You weren't speeding, at least you don't think you were. You pull over, hands slightly shaky, and before you even have time to gather yourself, there's a knock at your window. The officer's voice is calm but firm. Then it happens. "Can I see your ID?" Not your driver's license, not license and registration, just ID. And suddenly everything feels uncertain. Let me ask you something straight up. Have you ever been in a situation where a police officer asked for your ID and you weren't completely sure whether you legally had to give it? If you have, or even if you think you have, drop your experience in the comments. Seriously, I want to hear how it went for you, because what most people think they know about this situation is often incomplete, and in a moment, I'm going to show you why that misunderstanding can quietly cost you your rights. Now here's where things start to get uncomfortable, because this is one of those areas where law, real-world behavior, and human psychology all collide. Most people assume that if a police officer asks for ID, you just hand it over. No hesitation, no questions. That's what we've been conditioned to do. Movies, news, even basic driving advice, it all points in that direction. But the reality is more complicated and frankly more risky if you don't understand what's actually happening in that moment. Let's slow this down and walk through it like it's happening in real time. You're sitting in your car. The officer hasn't told you why you were stopped yet. There's no clear violation explained. No, you were going 15 over. No, you ran a red light. Just a presence, a uniform, and a request. "Can I see your ID?" That exact phrasing matters more than people realize, because in many situations, especially outside of a lawful traffic stop or detention, that request is not automatically backed by legal authority. But here's the problem. Most drivers don't pause long enough to recognize what stage of the interaction they're in. Are you being detained, or is this still a voluntary encounter? That distinction is everything. And this is where the exact phrase comes in, the one that can protect you without escalating the situation, without sounding confrontational, and without making you look like you're trying to outsmart the officer. Because let's be honest, tone matters. Delivery matters. The way you say something can completely change how the officer reacts. So here's the phrase. "Officer, am I being detained, or am I free to go?" Simple, calm, direct. But don't underestimate it. When you say that, you are not refusing. You are not arguing. You are asking the officer to clarify the legal basis of the interaction, and that forces a shift in the conversation. Now, let's talk about why this works. From the officer's perspective, every stop has layers. There's the initial reason for contact, there's observation, and there's escalation or de-escalation. Officers are trained to gather information quickly, often by asking open-ended or casual-sounding questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Mind if I take a look at your ID? These questions are not random. They are designed to assess behavior, consistency, nervousness, and sometimes to create a basis for further investigation. And here's where many drivers unintentionally make things worse. They start talking. A lot. They try to explain everything. They fill the silence. They volunteer details that were never asked for. And in doing so, they give the officer more material to work with, sometimes without even realizing it. I've seen situations where a simple stop for a broken taillight turned into a prolonged roadside investigation because the driver kept talking, kept explaining, kept trying to smooth things over. It doesn't always help. In fact, it often has the opposite effect. Now imagine a different scenario. Same stop, same officer, same request for ID. But this time, the driver pauses for just a second. Not in a confrontational way, not in a dramatic way, just enough to stay grounded. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question does two things instantly. First, it clarifies whether the officer has a legal reason to require identification. Second, it signals that you understand your rights, without being aggressive about it. And here's the part most people don't realize. Officers pay very close attention to how you say things, not just what you say. If you say that phrase with attitude, sarcasm, or hostility, you're going to get a completely different reaction than if you say it calmly, respectfully, and without tension. Body language matters too. Hands visible, no sudden movements, eye contact but not challenging. These small details shape the entire interaction, because from the officer's point of view, uncertainty equals risk. If you seem unpredictable, defensive, or overly nervous, that can escalate things, even if you haven't done anything wrong. Now let's get into a situation that confuses a lot of people. You're not driving, you're at home. There's a knock at your door. You open it, and there's a police officer standing there. "Can I see your ID?" This is where things really start to get misunderstood. Inside your home, your rights are at their strongest. The threshold for police authority is much higher than it is during a traffic stop. But again, most people default to compliance. They step outside. They hand over ID. They answer questions. And sometimes they don't even realize they've just shifted a voluntary interaction into something more serious. So let's walk through that moment carefully. You open the door. You stay inside. That's important. You don't step out unless there's a clear legal reason. The officer asks for ID. This is where that same principle applies, but with even greater weight. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If you're not being detained, you generally do not have to provide ID in your own home. But here's where people get tripped up. The officer might not answer directly. They might deflect. "Why are you worried about that?" "Just trying to ask you a few questions." "Do you have something to hide?" These responses are designed, intentionally or not, to create pressure. And this is where emotional control becomes critical. Because if you react defensively, if you get irritated, if you start arguing, you risk escalating the situation. Instead, you hold your ground calmly. "I understand, officer. I just want to clarify. Am I being detained or am I free to go?" Notice the repetition. Calm, consistent, non-confrontational. This is not about winning the interaction. It's about maintaining clarity and protecting your rights without creating unnecessary friction. Now let's shift back to the roadside, because this is where most people will actually face this situation. During a lawful traffic stop, you are required to provide your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. That's not optional. But here's the nuance. If you are a passenger, the rules can be different depending on the state and the situation, and that's where confusion often leads to mistakes. Passengers sometimes assume they must provide ID simply because the officer asked. Not always true. But again, how you handle it matters. If a passenger blurts out, "I don't have to give you anything," with attitude, that can escalate quickly. Instead, the same approach applies. "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question brings the focus back to legality, not emotion. Now let's talk about something people rarely think about in these moments. Timing. When you say something matters just as much as what you say. If you interrupt the officer mid-sentence, that can come off as disrespectful. If you wait too long, you might miss the moment where clarity matters. There's a rhythm to these interactions. The officer speaks. You listen. You respond, calmly, deliberately. And sometimes, silence is your best tool. Silence makes people uncomfortable. It creates space. It shifts pressure. Officers are trained to handle it, but it still changes the dynamic. If you answer every question immediately, you give away control of the pacing. But if you pause, even briefly, you give yourself time to think, to stay composed, to avoid saying something you'll regret. And trust me, people say things they regret during traffic stops all the time. "I only had a couple drinks. I didn't realize how fast I was going. I was just trying to get home quickly." These statements might feel harmless in the moment, but they can have real consequences later. Now let's address a common myth that needs to be shut down. Some people believe that asserting their rights will automatically make things worse. That's not entirely true, but it's also not entirely false. It depends on how you do it. If you assert your rights with hostility, yes, you're increasing the chances of escalation. But if you do it calmly, respectfully, and with awareness of the situation, you are simply engaging in a lawful interaction. There's a difference. And experienced officers know that difference. They've seen both types of behavior, the aggressive, confrontational approach and the calm, informed approach. They respond very differently to each. Now here's something that might surprise you. Sometimes, even when you ask the right question, even when you stay calm, the situation doesn't resolve quickly. The officer might continue asking questions. They might hold your documents longer than expected. They might change their tone. This is where patience becomes critical, because the biggest mistake people make at this stage is losing composure. They get frustrated. They start asking, "Why is this taking so long?" They raise their voice. They shift from calm to irritated. And in that moment, the entire interaction changes. From the officer's perspective, what was a routine stop can start to feel unpredictable, and unpredictability leads to caution. More caution can lead to more scrutiny. More scrutiny can lead to a longer stop. It's a chain reaction. So even if it feels unfair, even if it feels unnecessary, maintaining composure is not just about politeness. It's about controlling the trajectory of the encounter. Now, let's circle back to the core idea here. The phrase, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" is not a magic shield. It doesn't end every interaction. It doesn't guarantee a quick release. What it does is anchor the interaction in legality. It forces clarity. It creates a moment where the officer must either justify the detention or acknowledge that it is voluntary. And that moment matters, because without that clarity, people often drift into situations they don't fully understand, answering questions they didn't have to answer, providing information they didn't have to provide, staying longer than they needed to stay. And by the time they realize it, it's already too late. So the next time you see those blue lights or hear that knock at your door, remember this. Slow down, stay calm. Pay attention to what's actually being asked, and why. And when that moment comes, when you're not sure whether you're being required to comply or simply being requested to cooperate, you have a choice. Not a loud, dramatic choice, a quiet, controlled one. "Officer, am I being detained, or am I free to go?" Say it the right way, at the right time, and it might change the entire direction of that encounter. And once you've experienced that shift, once you've felt how different that interaction becomes, you start to see these situations in a completely new light. Not as something to fear, but as something to navigate carefully, deliberately, and with awareness that most people never take the time to develop.